Welcome to the Right News Network.
The world is moving fast, and so are we. I'm Emma Hurt, here with the stories you need to know. Oil prices have soared above $118 a barrel as global markets react to escalating tensions between the United States and Iran. President Trump has rejected an Iranian peace proposal and announced he will extend a blockade of Iranian ports until Tehran agrees to a new nuclear deal. The move has already disrupted diplomatic efforts and could have far-reaching consequences for energy prices and regional stability worldwide. The Federal Reserve is holding interest rates steady for a third straight meeting, but Wednesday's decision exposed a fractured policy board. The FOMC voted 8-4 to keep rates between 3.5 and 3.75%, the highest level of dissent since 1992, as oil surges and inflation concerns divide policymakers. With Jerome Powell's term ending May 15 and successor Kevin Warsh inching toward Senate confirmation, watch how the incoming chair addresses the Fed's deepest internal divisions in decades. Still on the court's major decisions this week, the Supreme Court has also been hearing arguments on immigration policy that could affect hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S. Our Middle East correspondent Layla Nazari has details on what's at stake for Syrians and Haitians with protected status.
Well, Emma, the justices heard oral arguments Wednesday over whether the Trump administration can strip temporary protected status, that's TPS, from around 600,000 Syrians and Haitians who've been living safely in America for years. These protections exist because of ongoing violence and instability in their home countries, but the administration wants to terminate them anyway.
What's the core legal question the court's wrestling with here?
Look, it really comes down to executive power. The Trump administration argues the president has authority to end TPS on his own once conditions improve, or he believes they've improved. But immigrant advocates and civil rights groups say that's not how the law works. They're arguing Congress set specific conditions for when TPS can end, and the administration can't just unilaterally decide those conditions are met. What's interesting is the court's conservative majority seemed skeptical of some of the administration's arguments during oral arguments, so this could go either way.
Layla Nazari, thank you for that. Russia's made a dramatic decision about one of its most important national celebrations. For the first time in nearly 20 years, this year's Victory Day parade won't feature the military hardware that's traditionally been the centerpiece. Our defense correspondent Marcus Webb is here to break this down for us. Marcus, what's driving this change?
Well, Emma, the Kremlin's blaming Ukraine's terrorist activity for forcing them to scale back the parade on May 9th. What's significant here is that for nearly 2 decades, this has been a showcase of Russian military might. Tanks, vehicles, the whole display rolling across Red Square. Now they're saying they can't safely do that anymore, which really underscores how vulnerable Moscow feels right now.
Does this reflect actual military capability from Ukraine, or is it more about perception?
Look, Ukraine's demonstrated some real striking power. We saw it just recently when a drone attack forced the closure of a Moscow airport. So this isn't just perception. Russia's genuinely concerned about Ukrainian drones reaching the capital. The fact that they're willing to scale back their most prestigious military pageant tells you they're taking the threat seriously. It's a pretty stunning admission of vulnerability during wartime.
Marcus, appreciate the context. Continuing on world affairs, London's Jewish community is reeling after a stabbing attack was declared a terrorist incident this week. Police arrested a 45-year-old man after he stabbed 2 men, ages 34 and 76, in the Golders Green neighborhood on Wednesday. The attack follows a series of recent arson attacks on synagogues and Jewish sites across the city, prompting authorities to treat antisemitic violence as an escalating security threat. Closer to home now, Australia secured a major commitment from China on something crucial to keeping the country running. Our Pacific correspondent Sarah Mitchell has this. Sarah?
Well, Emma, Foreign Minister Penny Wong has just confirmed that China's agreed to negotiate on jet fuel supplies. She was in Beijing for meetings, and honestly, one of them got pretty tense when Chinese officials actually tried to remove the media from the room. But the breakthrough's real. Wong says countries need to work together to keep fuel and goods flowing, and that's exactly what they're committing to do here.
Why is jet fuel such a critical issue right now?
Look, it's essential for aviation and defense operations, right? And Australia's had this rocky relationship with China over trade for years now. They've restricted Australian coal, wine, agricultural products. The list goes on. So securing stable supplies of something as vital as jet fuel from China, that's a big deal because it means we're not sitting vulnerable to another trade war. That's significant economically and strategically.
Sarah, appreciate it. Moving to the impact on global energy in your wallet, we're tracking two major stories today that affect Americans in very different ways. Our finance editor, Sophia Reeves, is here with more on what the Fed and OPEC are doing right now. Sophia?
Thanks, Emma. So we've got the UAE officially pulling out of OPEC after 62 years, which is a really big deal for global oil markets. And at the same time, the Federal Reserve just announced it's holding interest rates steady at 5.25 to 5.50%. These two things are going to ripple through your mortgage payments, your credit card bills, everything.
Why is the UAE leaving OPEC such a turning point right now?
Well, look, the UAE's been diversifying its economy away from oil for years, right? So they don't need OPEC's production quotas anymore. They want to pump more oil and make more money on their own terms. That's going to break apart the cartel's ability to control prices the way they have for 6 decades. It's honestly a power shift in Middle Eastern politics.
And what does the Fed holding rates mean for someone shopping for a mortgage or a car?
I mean, the good news is rates aren't going up. Mortgage rates are hovering around 7% right now, and they'll probably stay there through the summer. The Fed's basically saying inflation is coming down enough that they don't need to keep tightening. What's interesting is, if the UAE flood increases global oil supply, gas prices could drop, which would actually help that inflation story even more.
Sophia, appreciate it. Still on world affairs, the ripple effects of the Iran war are now hitting Americans' wallets at the gas pump and in mortgage payments. Layla rejoins me now. Layla, what's the latest on what's driving these price spikes?
Well, Emma, it's really about supply. Crude oil from the Middle East is being disrupted because of the conflict, and you're seeing that reflected right now at the pump. We're looking at 4-year highs for gas prices, averaging $4.23 a gallon. What's interesting is it's not just energy. Mortgage rates are climbing too because bond markets are reacting to all these negative headlines coming out of the region.
Is there any indication these negotiations could restart and bring prices back down?
Look, honestly, the signals aren't great right now. Both sides seem pretty dug in, and there's not a lot of momentum for talks to resume in the near term. So what we're probably looking at is sustained pressure on prices through the summer, which is exactly when Americans are planning vacations and road trips. That's the real problem here. The timing couldn't be worse for consumers.
Layla, appreciate the context. Continuing on world affairs, the conflict in Iran is creating a perfect storm of economic and humanitarian crises affecting millions globally. The United Nations this week documented 21 executions and over 4,000 arrests by Tehran, while oil prices have nearly doubled, forcing Pakistan to spend 167% more on weekly energy imports. European leaders warn the ripple effects could last years without a swift resolution. Now we turn to our in-depth segment. One story, every angle, the full picture. Supreme Court has had one of its busiest weeks in recent memory. A landmark 6-3 ruling striking down Louisiana's congressional map as an unconstitutional racial gerrymander, oral arguments on whether hundreds of thousands of Haitian and Syrian nationals can be stripped of their temporary protected status, a unanimous 9-0 victory for a Christian pregnancy center against New Jersey's government, and a New York Times report that all 6 conservative justices attended a private dinner with President Trump and King Charles. That is a lot happening at once, and every single one of these stories has enormous implications for American law, politics, and the relationship between citizens and the state. Joining me now are Marcus Webb, our defense and security analyst, and Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor. Marcus, let me start with you. Is this Supreme Court operating as an independent legal institution, or has it become the political arm of the conservative movement?
Thanks, Emma. Look, that framing is exactly what the institutional left wants you to accept, and we shouldn't dignify it. What happened in Louisiana v. Calais is constitutionally straightforward. The state drew a congressional district using race as the predominant factor. The court said that violates the 14th Amendment. End of story. The Equal Protection Clause doesn't have an asterisk that says, except when Democrats think it's politically useful. And what's remarkable about this ruling is that it wasn't even close. 6 justices, including at least some who are not regarded as movement conservatives, signed on to the core reasoning. Ben Shapiro made the point years ago that the moment you accept racial engineering of electoral maps, you've accepted that democracy itself is racially sorted. That's not civil rights. That's the opposite of civil rights. As for the dinner with King Charles and President Trump, yes, it looks bad. Roberts has spent 20 years building the image of an above-the-fray institution, and his colleagues have just handed the left a gift-wrapped talking point. But optics are not evidence of corruption, and conflating the two is intellectually dishonest. The real story this week is not who ate dinner with whom. It's that the Constitution is being applied as written, and the people screaming loudest about it are the ones who preferred the old arrangement, where race was quietly baked into every map in America.
But Marcus, devil's advocate here, NPR is calling this ruling a gutting of the Voting Rights Act. Civil rights organizations are describing it as a rollback of decades of progress, and the dissenting justices themselves warned of serious consequences for minority representation. Isn't there a legitimate argument that colorblind idealism collides with color-conscious reality in places like Louisiana? And Sophia, what's your take on this?
Well, look, I think Marcus is broadly right on the constitutional principle, but here's what I think he's glossing over. The practical question isn't just, is the Constitution colorblind? It's what are the real-world downstream effects on political representation? And I want to be careful here because the data matters. Louisiana is 33% Black. The question of how that community gets represented in Congress is not a trivial one. Now, I'm not saying the map was constitutional. Clearly, the court disagreed. But the reason this ruling will have ripple effects nationwide is because it's going to invite legal challenges to a whole range of existing districts in Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, states where similar logic was used in drawing maps. And heading into the 2026 midterms, that's a political and legal earthquake. The trajectory here suggests we are going to see an avalanche of redistricting litigation over the next 12 months, and that uncertainty is genuinely destabilizing for electoral planning at the state level. Where I push back on the left's narrative is the claim that race-conscious maps are the only mechanism for minority representation. That's empirically wrong. Black candidates have won in majority white districts. Hispanic candidates have dominated in districts that aren't drawn for them. The idea that you need to sort people by skin color to give them a political voice is both patronizing and demonstrably false.
I hear what Sophia is saying, but with respect, I think she's letting the left's framing sneak in through the back door. We are not rolling back civil rights by enforcing the Constitution. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were designed to stop states from excluding people based on race. They were not designed to mandate racial arithmetic in congressional maps. Those are fundamentally different things. And here's the thing. The TPS story is even bigger than the redistricting case, and nobody's talking about it loudly enough. We have 860,000 people in this country on a status that has the word temporary in its name. Haiti has had TPS protection since 2010. That's 16 years. Temporary. If the Supreme Court tells the executive branch it cannot revoke TPS, then the word temporary means nothing. The executive branch has no meaningful immigration authority. More. And every future administration of either party is hamstrung. That is a constitutional crisis in slow motion. Tucker Carlson's been saying for years that the administrative and judicial erasure of executive immigration authority is how you get permanent open borders without ever passing a single law. He's right.
Here's what I want to know. If the Supreme Court does rule in favor of the Trump administration on TPS, we're potentially looking at mass deportation proceedings for hundreds of thousands of people who've been here for years, some for over a decade. Sophia, where do you see this going? And is the administration actually prepared for what comes next?
The way I see this playing out, there are two very different outcomes depending on how broadly the court rules. If it's a narrow ruling, affirming executive authority in this specific case, but leaving TPS intact as a framework, you get a manageable transition period, significant political noise, but not a logistical catastrophe. If it's a broad ruling that dramatically expands executive discretion over immigration status more generally, the trajectory suggests we're heading into an implementation crisis. ICE and the broader immigration enforcement infrastructure simply do not have the capacity to process hundreds of thousands of status changes simultaneously, and the legal challenges that would follow in lower courts would be enormous. What history tells us is that bold immigration enforcement announcements tend to outpace operational reality, and the risk here is that the administration wins the legal argument and then struggles visibly with the implementation, which hands the Democrats the political narrative they desperately need heading into 2026.
Here's what concerns me most, and this cuts across both stories. The left's response to every one of these rulings is going to be court packing. They've already been floating it. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Cori Bush, members of the House Judiciary Committee, they've been laying the groundwork for arguing that a conservative supermajority is an illegitimate institution. The dinner optics don't help, and if they can successfully delegitimize the court in public perception, the institutional left doesn't need to win the legal arguments anymore. They just need to convince enough Americans that the court itself is tainted. That is a deeply dangerous trajectory for constitutional governance, and Roberts walking into that dinner, knowing what the political environment looks like, was frankly a serious misjudgment.
A Supreme Court enforcing the Constitution as written, and half the country treating that as a scandal. Marcus Webb, Sophia Reeves, thank you both. One thing is certain tonight. Somewhere in the Democratic National Committee, someone is drafting a fundraising email about judicial corruption, and the justices have handed them the first paragraph for free. The United States has now spent $25 billion on its joint war with Israel against Iran, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth spent Wednesday getting absolutely grilled by lawmakers who say the whole thing was launched without proper congressional approval. Iran's regime has executed at least 21 people since the conflict began on February 28. Germany's Chancellor Merz is now saying Iran has humiliated Trump, and the Pentagon is sitting on a $1.5 trillion budget request that lawmakers are eyeing with serious suspicion. This is a story about strategy, sovereignty, and whether America is winning or slowly bleeding out. Joining me now are Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor, and James Chen, our geopolitical analyst. Sophia, let me start with you. Is $25 billion in 2 months a sign that this war is working, or a sign that it's already spiraling out of control?
Thanks, Emma. Look, I think the framing of $25 billion and nothing to show for it is fundamentally dishonest. And that dishonesty is coming from very deliberate places. The Democratic lawmakers in that hearing room today weren't making strategic arguments. They were making political ones. They want to talk about process, about congressional authorization, about Pete Hegseth's personnel decisions. What they won't do, what they are constitutionally incapable of doing in that hearing room, is make an honest case that leaving Iran's nuclear program intact was the better option. Douglas Murray has been saying for years that the West's problem isn't acting too aggressively against rogue regimes. It's acting too late and too timidly. We were already past the point of comfortable diplomacy with Iran. The JCPOA was a disaster. The Biden-era attempts to revive it were an embarrassment. Somebody had to act, and the Trump administration acted. Is $25 billion a lot of money? Absolutely. But the question isn't whether $25 billion is expensive. The question is what a nuclear-armed Iran costs the world. And nobody in that hearing room was prepared to answer that.
But Sophia, Chancellor Merz of Germany, not exactly a left-wing figure, is saying Iran has humiliated Trump. The FT is reporting that the U.S. is burning through missiles faster than it can replace them, which raises real questions about readiness in the Indo-Pacific. Is there a legitimate case that the strategic cost is already outrunning the strategic gain? And James, what's your take on this?
Well, look, I don't entirely disagree with Sophia on the big picture, but I think she's glossing over something that matters enormously from a pure strategic resource standpoint. The $25 billion figure in 2 months is not just a political talking point. It's a real operational constraint. The FT's reporting on missile stockpile depletion is serious. We're not talking about abstract budget numbers here. We're talking about depleting the actual munitions inventory that the United States would need if China decided this was the moment to move on Taiwan. The Indo-Pacific theater requires readiness that cannot be sacrificed on the altar of Middle East operations, no matter how justified those operations are strategically. And here's the data point that should worry everyone. The $1.5 trillion Pentagon budget request reflects a defense industrial base that has been chronically underfunded and simply cannot replenish stockpiles at the rate this conflict is consuming them. Merz's comment about humiliation might be European defeatism, but the underlying operational concern about sustainability isn't wrong.
I hear what James is saying, but with respect, that misses the point entirely about what we're actually weighing here. Yes, stockpile depletion is a real concern. Nobody's pretending it isn't. But the alternative logic that James is implying, that we should have held back military action against Iran to preserve readiness for a hypothetical Taiwan scenario, is exactly the kind of paralysis by analysis that has defined Western strategic failure for 2 decades. Iran executing 21 of its own people since February 28th tells you something. Regimes that are winning don't accelerate internal repression. Regimes that are scared do. That's not spin. That's a data point about the pressure working. And I want to be very direct. The Democrats in that hearing room questioning Pete Hegseth about process and Pentagon firings are not worried about military readiness. They are worried about the 2026 midterms. That's the honest truth.
Here's what I want to know, because this is the question that actually matters for the next 6 months. Is there an achievable end state here? Or are we watching the opening act of a conflict that has no defined finish line? Because that, to me, is the most dangerous scenario of all. James, where do you see this going?
The way I see this playing out, there are really only 2 credible paths forward in the next 6 months. Either the military pressure has genuinely degraded Iran's nuclear infrastructure enough that the regime, which remember has been executing its own people, which historically signals internal panic, comes to some back-channel negotiated framework, or we enter a prolonged operational commitment that becomes normalized without resolution. And history tells us that Iran is extraordinarily good at using diplomacy as a breathing space for reconstitution. Whatever framework emerges, if it doesn't have permanent intrusive verification and explicit military triggers for violation, it's worse than useless. It gives Iran legitimacy while preserving capability. The risk trajectory here concerns me deeply.
Here's what concerns me most, and I think this is the scenario that nobody in Washington is being honest about. The real danger isn't that this conflict escalates beyond control. The real danger is that it gets politically strangled at home before it reaches a decisive conclusion. If Democratic opposition successfully conditions emergency supplemental funding, and they have the parliamentary tools to do it, the trajectory could lead to an operational slowdown that Iran reads as weakness and exploits accordingly. That is the nightmare. A conflict launched with strategic clarity ended through domestic political attrition, with Iran wounded but not finished. That is more dangerous than either fully committing or never starting. And right now, looking at those hearing room dynamics, looking at the $25 billion headline being weaponized, I think that risk is higher than people realize.
Sophia Reeves, James Chen, a genuinely heated and genuinely important debate. Thank you both. One thing is absolutely certain tonight. Somewhere in Tehran, they are watching that congressional hearing very, very closely and hoping the Democrats keep asking questions. That's your briefing for now. I'm Emma Hurt. Stay safe, stay informed, and we'll be back shortly.